In the golden haze of old Hollywood, the cameras never stopped rolling, but offset, the shadows told a different story. Behind every dazzling premiere and smoky nightclub, there were unspoken rules, powerful figures you never crossed, and phone calls you prayed would never come. These were the stars who smiled for the public while glancing over their shoulders in private. Stay with us, because by the end, you'll see just how deep those shadows could reach. Frank Sinatra, the voice who sang for the shadows. In the glittering clubs of New York and the neon glow of Las Vegas, his voice could melt room. But behind the spotlight, Sinatra moved through a far more dangerous stage. He didn't need to read a headline to know who was running many of the rooms he sang in. The introductions were made in back corridors, over quiet toasts, and sealed with eyes that measured every word. There were nights when he'd finish a set and be escorted not to his dressing room, but to a secluded booth where powerful men would suggest favors, introductions, or appearances that were never part of any contract. In Vegas, certain tables at the front were always reserved, and Sinatra knew better than to keep them waiting. Friends and rivals alike whispered about the time he was summoned out of state on a moment's notice, returning days later with nothing but a smile and a tighter circle of trust. He mastered the art of charm, not just for the crowd, but for the men who could rewrite his future over a single glass of whiskey. In that world, every note he sang was a performance, but the most important act was the one no one ever saw. Dean Martin, the cool one who knew when to keep quiet. Dean Martin's public image was effortless charm, a smooth voice, an easy laugh, and the air of a man who never took life too seriously. But in the smoky heart of 1950s Las Vegas, cool wasn't just an act, it was a survival skill. Martin worked the same casino stages that doubled as meeting grounds for some of the most influential underworld figures in America. He had a gift for making everyone feel like his friend, but he also knew when to let a conversation trail off, when not to ask a follow-up question, and when to pretend he hadn't noticed who slipped into the room. Fellow performers told stories of Dean being pulled aside between sets, disappearing into a back hallway with a man in a tailored suit, and emerging minutes later with a grin that gave nothing away. In Martin's world, silence wasn't awkward, it was currency. He never flaunted connections, never tried to leverage favors, and above all, he never forgot that in certain circles, a raised eyebrow could say more than a threat. His on-stage persona might have been all fun and games, but off-stage, Dean Martin played the long game, and that's how he kept his name in lights without ever letting it end up on the wrong list. Jerry Lewis, the comic who laughed carefully. Jerry Lewis could light up a stage with manic energy, rapid-fire jokes, and a face that seemed made of rubber. Audiences adored him, but behind the curtain, he was playing a more delicate role. In the nightclub circuit of the late 1940s and early 50s, Lewis often performed in venues where the front row wasn't filled with ordinary fans, but with sharply dressed men who didn't bother ordering from the menu. He knew some were there to enjoy the show, others to size him up. There were whispers about certain bookings, how a last-minute request would have him flying across the country to do a single-night set, no questions asked. He understood the unwritten rule. If someone powerful wanted you on that stage, you got on that stage, even if it meant rearranging your entire schedule. Lewis, who thrived on improvisation in comedy, learned to improvise in conversation too, sidestepping questions, offering compliments, and keeping his most candid thoughts behind a locked smile. Those who knew him well said he had a way of reading a room instantly, sensing when the laughter was genuine and when it was a signal that the meeting was over. In a business where timing was everything, Jerry Lewis understood that sometimes the most important punchline was the one you didn't say out loud. Sammy Davis Jr., the showman who danced on a razor's edge. Sammy Davis Jr. could do it all, sing, dance, act, and charm an audience so completely they forgot about everything else. But in mid-century Las Vegas, where the spotlight was controlled as much by backroom deals as by stage managers, his rise meant navigating a minefield with style. He played to sold-out crowds in casinos where the real power didn't sit in the front row. It waited upstairs in private suites. Sammy's talent earned him respect, but it also drew attention from men who expected that respect returned in quiet, unquestioning ways. There were nights when he'd finish a blistering performance only to be told a friend was waiting to see him, and he'd be led into a room where every seat was already taken and every eye was watching. In those moments, Sammy knew the choreography wasn't about dance steps, it was about saying the right thing, showing gratitude without weakness, and never letting his nerves show. He was a master at keeping the room laughing, even when the air was thick with tension. To the public, Sammy Davis Jr. was pure joy, Behind the curtain, he was a man who understood that in a city run on both music and muscle, the wrong note could end the show before the encore. Marilyn Monroe, the star who knew the spotlight could burn. Marilyn Monroe's radiance was undeniable, a presence so magnetic that cameras seemed to follow her even when they weren't rolling. But her world wasn't made up only of directors, agents, and fellow actors. In certain glittering hotel suites and private parties, she found herself among men whose smiles were as sharp as their tailored suits. Invitations would arrive that weren't really requests, and declining them could close doors faster than any bad review. There were dinners where the conversation danced between flattery and quiet implication, where a hand on her shoulder felt less like affection and more like a reminder. Marilyn learned to move gracefully through these rooms, laughing at the right moments, steering topics away from dangerous waters, and making a polite exit before the mood shifted. Those closest to her knew she had an instinct for reading people. She could sense when charm was genuine and when it was a mask. On screen, she was the dream everyone wanted to hold. Off-screen, she understood that some dreams were laced with shadows, and that surviving them meant knowing exactly when to smile and when to slip away. Tony Bennett, the crooner who sang between the lines. Tony Bennett's voice carried a warmth that felt untouched by the harsher edges of the world, but his early years in show business taught him that even the most beautiful music could be played in a dangerous key. Starting out in the smoky nightclubs of New York, he quickly learned that many of the best-paying stages were controlled by people who didn't advertise their ownership. There were times when a booking came through without his manager ever negotiating it, and saying no simply wasn't part of the conversation. Bennett would step onto a stage knowing exactly who was in the room, and that the real applause often came from the tables in the shadows. He told friends about private gatherings where the set list was chosen for him, where his job was to sing, smile, and leave without lingering too long. Navigating those moments required more than talent. It called for discretion, humility, and an almost instinctive understanding of unspoken boundaries. To audiences, Tony Bennett was the picture of ease, a man entirely at home in his art. But beneath that easy smile was the quiet awareness that some listeners weren't there for the music alone, and that the safest way to keep singing was to never ask why. Joey Bishop, the wisecracker who never crossed the line. Joey Bishop built his reputation on quick wit and perfectly timed comebacks, the kind that could turn a dull moment into a roar of laughter. As a key member of the Rat Pack, he shared the stage and the backstage with some of the biggest names in entertainment, often in clubs where the most important audience members weren't listed on the marquee. Bishop understood early that comedy was about knowing your crowd, and in certain Vegas showrooms, the crowd could include men who took offense as quickly as they laughed. He was careful with his jokes, steering clear of anything that might cut too close to real power. Those who worked with him remembered how, if an unfamiliar figure entered the green room mid-conversation, Joey could change the subject without breaking his rhythm, turning a risky remark into harmless banter before anyone noticed. Offstage, he kept his social circle tight, and his opinions even tighter, avoiding the kind of gossip that could travel into the wrong ears. To the public, Joey Bishop seemed fearless behind the microphone, but those in the business knew his greatest skill wasn't just delivering the punchline. It was making sure the laughter never came at the wrong person's expense. Lana Turner, the beauty who lived under watchful eyes. Lana Turner's name was a fixture on theater marquees, her face gracing magazine covers across the country. To the public, she was the picture of elegance and romance, but in her private life, the company she kept sometimes came with unspoken risks. Hollywood's social scene in the 1940s and 50s often overlapped with powerful figures from far beyond the studio gates, and Lana found herself in circles where charm could turn to pressure in the space of a sentence. Friends noticed how she could hold her own in any conversation, smiling warmly while keeping her real thoughts well guarded. At certain dinners or nightclub appearances, she'd be seated beside men whose reputations were an open secret, and she knew better than to let surprise or disapproval show on her face. Over the years, she became adept at reading a room, gauging who held the real influence, and adjusting her presence accordingly. On screen, Lana Turner seemed untouchable, a star who floated above the troubles of the world. Off-screen, she understood that every glittering evening had an undertow, and that staying afloat meant knowing exactly when to lean into the spotlight and when to let it pass her by. George Raft, the gangster who didn't have to pretend. George Raft made his name playing tough, streetwise gangsters on screen, but his connection to that world didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Born in New York's Hell's Kitchen, Raff grew up around men who lived by rules never written down, and when he arrived in Hollywood, he carried that past with him. His real-life friendships with known underworld figures were no secret, and while they gave him credibility in his film roles, they also put him in situations that demanded careful navigation. There were times when studio executives leaned on him to smooth things over with certain nightclub owners or promoters, a task he handled with a quiet word rather than open confrontation. In social settings, Raff was unfailingly polite but never naive, knowing that a favor today might be remembered years later in ways that weren't optional. Colleagues noticed how quickly his tone could shift from friendly banter to stone-cold seriousness if someone pushed too far. To the audience, George Raft was just another Hollywood tough guy. To those who knew better, he was a man who understood that the most dangerous scenes in life didn't have scripts, and the stakes were far higher than box office numbers. Jean Harlow, the platinum star, who played it careful. Jean Harlow's dazzling screen presence made her one of the brightest icons of the 1930s, a star whose very name sold tickets. But fame in that era meant more than glamorous premieres and studio contracts. It also meant navigating a town where money and influence didn't always come from the front office. MGM's world was full of powerful men whose connections reached far beyond the film industry, and Harlow's success brought her into rooms where charm was expected and silence was sometimes safer than honesty. At certain private gatherings, she'd listen more than she spoke, laughing at the right moments while offering little of herself in return. Friends described her as quick-witted but cautious, able to shift a conversation without anyone realizing it. The studio system often shielded its stars from scandal, but Harlow seemed to understand instinctively that some situations couldn't be fixed with good publicity. She kept her closest confidences within a very small circle, knowing that even an innocent remark could find its way to someone who preferred their name left out of stories. On screen, Jean Harlow played women who could outtalk any man. Off-screen, she knew that in certain company, the smartest move was to let others do the talking. Bing Crosby, the gentleman who knew where the power sat. Bing Crosby's easy baritone and laid-back charm made him one of the most beloved entertainers of his time, a voice that could calm a room and a presence that felt completely at ease. But behind the polished image, Crosby moved through a show business landscape where most lucrative opportunities often came with unspoken conditions. Performing in top clubs and hotels, he quickly recognized that the best seats in the house were reserved for guests who didn't need their names on the bill. There were engagements where his schedule shifted overnight, with little explanation beyond a quiet assurance that it was important. Crosby had a knack for making everyone feel welcome, but he also knew when to let conversations drift toward safe topics, never probing too far into how certain deals were made or who was really behind them. Colleagues remembered how, at parties, he could excuse himself just as the talk began to turn toward business that wasn't for every ear. To the public, Bing Crosby seemed to live in a world of golf courses and recording studios. In reality, he understood that success in his field meant knowing exactly who held the power and making sure they always felt respected. Peter Lawford, the charmer who walked a tightrope. Peter Lawford moved effortlessly between worlds, Hollywood royalty, political circles, and the glittering stages of Las Vegas. But that unique position put him in the middle of relationships where the lines between friendship, business, and influence were anything but clear. As a member of the Rat Pack and the Kennedy family by marriage, Lawford often found himself hosting or attending gatherings where film stars mingled with men whose reputations were discussed only in whispers. He was valued for his diplomacy, the way he could smooth over tensions with a joke or a well-timed change of subject, but those close to him knew it wasn't just charm, it was survival. Invitations to certain events weren't optional, and declining them could send the wrong message to the wrong people. Lawford learned to read every room with precision, watching who arrived together, who avoided eye contact, and who commanded attention without saying a word. In public, he appeared completely at ease, the life of the party. In private, he understood that he was constantly balancing on a narrow line, one misstep away from trouble. Peter Lawford's gift wasn't just that he knew everyone, it was that he knew exactly how to keep all of them happy, even when their worlds quietly collided. Tony Curtis, the leading man who chose his words wisely. Tony Curtis rose to fame with matinee idol looks and a quicksilver charm that made him a natural fit for both comedies and dramas. But as his career took him from Hollywood soundstages to high-profile nightclub appearances, he learned that not every audience came for the movies. In certain cities, the most influential figures didn't sit in the spotlight, but controlled it from the shadows, and Curtis understood the importance of making the right impression. At private gatherings, he would listen intently, laugh when it was expected, and avoid steering the conversation anywhere that might turn tense. He was known for telling stories that entertained without revealing too much, a way of speaking that left people smiling, but offered no loose threads for gossip. There were occasions when a last-minute opportunity appeared on his schedule, and he treated each one as if it were the most important night of his career, no matter how unusual the arrangement. To his fans, Tony Curtis was an open book. To those who worked closely with him, he was a man who knew some chapters were better left unwritten. Judy Garland, the songbird who understood the game. Judy Garland's voice could fill a theater and leave audiences spellbound, but her years in the entertainment business taught her that talent alone didn't keep the doors open. In the nightclub circuit, especially in the golden age of Vegas, she encountered the quiet, unmistakable presence of people whose influence stretched far beyond music or film. Some engagements came through official channels, others through conversations that bypassed agents entirely. Judy had a gift for making everyone in a room feel like an old friend, but she also knew when to draw the curtain around her private life. At exclusive parties, she would work the room gracefully, offering warmth without committing to anything that might come back to her later. She learned early that a polite laugh, a compliment, or a gentle change of subject could defuse a conversation before it turned into something more complicated. On stage, she gave herself completely to the audience. Off stage, she played a quieter role, one where the performance was in knowing exactly what to give and what to keep to herself. In the golden glow of old Hollywood, these stars gave the world their talent, their charm, and their unforgettable performances. But behind the scenes, they navigated a world where the stakes were higher than box office numbers, a world of quiet negotiations, unspoken rules, and watchful eyes. Their stories remind us that even the brightest lights cast deep shadows, and that survival in that era took more than fame. It took instinct, composure, and an unshakable sense of when to step forward and when to step back. If you've enjoyed stepping into this hidden side of Hollywood's history, subscribe for more untold stories from the silver screen, because there's always another chapter waiting in the wings.